I'm Richard Chambers, the Senior Advisor of Risk and Audit for Audit Board, and welcome to another podcast in my continuing series, Speaking of Risk and Audit. I'm really honored today to be joined by Dave Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States. Dave and I have known each other for more than 20 years, and it's really a great honor to have him join me on my podcast. Dave, welcome.
Good to be back with you, Richard. Look forward to the opportunity here.
Thank you very much. Dave, I think when we first met, I might have been the Inspector General at TVA and you were the Comptroller General, and you served on. I didn't stay as long in my role as you did. You stayed on for a few more years. And then you stepped down to lead the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. That was an organization dedicated to increasing public awareness of the fiscal challenges that the country is facing, that the U.S. is facing. And then you later went on to found Comeback America Initiative, the Comeback America Initiative, and have been a real crusader for government fiscal responsibility for more than a decade. Maybe you could take a couple of minutes here and share a bit about your journey since you stepped down as Comptroller General so our audience has a better feel for what your passion is here.
Sure, happy to do that. Paul Volcker, may God rest his soul, the former Fed chairman, called me the Paul Revere of fiscal responsibility, so I was honored to hear that from him. As Comptroller General, I was the Chief Accountability Officer of the United States, the Auditor General of the United States, and the CEO of the GAO. It was a great job, best job I probably ever had. I will be honest to tell you that if I knew then what I know now, I probably would have completed my 15-year term rather than leaving after about 10 years. But I ran the Peterson Foundation. Pete Peterson, a great man, may God rest his soul, goes all the way back to the Nixon administration serving in government. And I helped to get that started, hired all the people, put it on the map. And we clearly made a difference. But after about 2.5, 3 years, I spun off, went to the Comeback America Initiative, which was my own not-for-profit, in order to focus on a broader range of issues. I mean, taxes, spending, et cetera, but also federal, state, local. I had a broader interest than just the social insurance programs, which was primarily but not exclusively what Pete was focused on. And, then after that, I ended up becoming a professor at the Naval Academy, a senior advisor with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Bottom line, what I focus on is federal fiscal responsibility and government transformation. And I wear a lot of hats. You can tell, I change them a lot. That's why I don't have much hair left, in addition to having a teenage daughter a number of years ago, but we won't go there. And so I keep pretty busy. Richard.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm always inspired when I see you on the news broadcasts and other outlets advocating for greater fiscal responsibility. But Dave, the sad truth is that the U.S. national debt has continued to climb and is now soared to more than $37 trillion. Why should U.S. fiscal policy that continues to fuel debt growth concern Americans? Why, we have politicians who sort of dismiss this as not really being that serious, but why should Americans in general be concerned, and what risk does it present to American companies whom their risk officers are maybe in our audience?
Well, unfortunately, most politicians in Washington on both sides of the aisle have become addicted to spending, deficits, and debt. And my latest book, America in 2040, Still a Superpower, which if people are interested can find out more at american2040.com. I learned from history and learned from others about how superpowers that were once great fell, and in some cases no longer exist, and also learn from other countries what their experience has been. The truth is, the United States is the leading superpower in the world today with economic, diplomatic, national security, and cultural influence around the world. But the leading indicator on the way up and the leading indicator on the way down as a superpower is economic power. And if you can't put your finances in order, you will lose economic power over time. And there are many lessons in history where that's been the case. We have lost control of our finances. And you talk about the 37 trillion, that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you add unfunded civilian and military pensions, retiree health care, other liabilities, unfunded social insurance obligations, the real number is well over $125 trillion and growing much faster than the economy. And so what's the risk? Well, the risk is at some point in time, we're going to lose the confidence of our investors. And when we lose the confidence of our investors, meaning in debt, there's going to be a failed auction. And when there's a failed auction, then the Fed and the banks will end up doing a number of things to try to provide temporary relief. But ultimately, the only thing that's going to restore confidence of our investors is if we start making the tough choices on spending and revenues and budget controls. And if we don't, we're likely to have, at a minimum, stagflation and potentially a global depression. And I would respectfully suggest that's not something that anybody should want.
Oh, absolutely not. You know, people throw around the word debt crisis. They'd say we could potentially have a debt crisis in this country. What does that mean, and what would a debt crisis look like?
It would be a failed auction in most likelihood, along the lines of what I talked about, with a significant increase in interest rates, significant decline in the market, significant decline in the value of the dollar, significant increase in unemployment, and as I said, the real possibility of stagflation. And if we don't end up gaining control of our finances and restoring confidence quickly, could end up resulting in a global depression. None of those things are desirable. And it's not a matter of if we'll have a debt crisis, it's when, if we don't change course. And then the other issue is that people don't think about is Social Security, our social insurance program. Social Security, probably the most important, clearly the most popular social insurance program in the United States. After the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, it actually accelerated the date of exhaustion of the trust funds to where it's going to be late 2032. That's not that far away. In addition, it increased the amount of cuts that would be necessary at that point in time. 24% of benefits would have to be cut immediately. Believe me, that's not equitable. It's not desirable. It's not politically feasible. The question is, when are we going to do something about it?
Well, speaking of doing something about it, I mean, a few months ago, we were all immersed in news about Doge, this Department of Government Efficiency that President Trump chartered almost from the day he took office. What was your assessment of the work that Doge did? Were they on the right track? And what do you think needs to be done beyond what Doge has been doing?
Well, first, I was hopeful. I have a great respect for Elon Musk. He's obviously, the wealthiest person on earth, but more importantly, a real innovator, if you will. And I know that, President Trump wants to make major government transformation happen. But I think it's important you understand not just what needs to be done, but how you do it matters. Okay. And so, with regard to Doge, they said that they were doing an audit. They weren't doing an audit. You and I know what an audit is. They don't know what an audit is. I mean, basically, what they did is they did a transactional review using artificial intelligence, trying to identify possible or probable, fraud, waste, abuse, or mismanagement. A vast majority of what they found was really policy differences. They weren't necessarily illegal, much less, fraud. Okay. There was some mismanagement, there's no question. But I think Elon Musk, quite frankly, and the Doge team didn't understand how the government works. They can't cut government spending. Only Congress can cut government spending. Therefore, if they come up with a contract they want to cancel, if they come up with a grant they want to cancel, that's fine. But unless Congress rescinds the fund, they've got to spend it on something else. Although I will tell you that they did discover, I think later on, that the only way that they can for sure save money is hiring freezes, voluntary outs, and involuntary reductions in force. Because unlike appropriations, the Congress provides a ceiling on FTEs, full-time equivalents, not a floor. And that's why I think they turn to that as a way to save money. But again, it's not just what you do, but how you do it. When you're making those kinds of decisions, it's got to be based upon the mission of the agency and the skills, knowledge, and performance of the individuals. It's not clear to me that's how it was done. And so what remains to be done is something that I've been advocating for a long time that I'm trying to get the private sector to fund, and that is let's take a comprehensive look at the federal government. What is it now as compared to what the founders intended? What is it now as compared to the authorizing legislation for all these departments and agencies? You and I know there's been huge mission creep. What are we trying to accomplish? How do we measure success in outcome based terms? How are we doing? When you do that, you're in a position to make a much more dramatic, comprehensive, and transformational change to what government does, how it does it, and how it measures success. And that's what needs to be done. And by the way, the federal government by law is supposed to have a comprehensive strategic plan that is future focused and outcome oriented. And guess what? It doesn't have one. And so as a result, what's happening is we're flying blind in growing mountains of debt without an instrument panel. I'd call that pretty imprudent.
Yeah, one of the things that, if I recall correctly, that you kind of forged there at the GAO was sort of an annual assessment of high risk areas or high
Yeah.
risk agencies. In fact, I think I was at Postal Service when maybe you guys first added a postal service to that list. Is there enough emphasis in government? I think you sort of answered this a minute ago, but does government really have a strategy by which it can assess its risks?
No. The truth is we have several maladies in government, at least at the federal level. Myopia, which is short sightedness, tunnel vision, looking at one issue at a time without understanding the bigger picture, the collateral impact, the domino effect, if you will, of a change here or elsewhere. And secondly, self interest, which in the case of politicians is I want to get reelected. And to get reelected, I don't necessarily want to have to make the tough choices. And therefore, I just kick the can down the road and increase the risk of a major crisis. In fairness, my predecessor, Chuck Bowser, started the high risk list. It comes out every 2 years at the beginning of each Congress. It represents a list of programs and activities that are higher risk of fraud, waste, abuse, or mismanagement. You're correct. I did put the Postal Service on it when I was Comptroller General, but I did something else. I put an asterisk by it. And what did the asterisk mean? It meant that Congress was part of the problem and Congress needed to be part of the solution. It meant that management could not solve the problem by itself. That Congress had placed certain impediments, and it needed to grant additional flexibility and authority to the Postal Service for it to be viable longer term. I'll also tell you, Richard, that before 9/11, 2001, and we all know what happened on that tragic day, I was testifying in Congress. I held up my then BlackBerry. Now I have a smartphone, and I told the members of Congress that this is competition to the Postal Service. They looked at me with a blind stare. They had no idea what the BlackBerry was. And they said, "Why do you say that?" I said, "Because it's got something on it called email. And email is going to have a direct impact on first class mail for the Postal Service, which is the most profitable part of the Postal Service." And that, by the way, is an example of foresight.
Yeah. Well, you know, Dave, we talked about Doge a few minutes ago. Are there things that government auditors, the GAO auditors and evaluators and the IG auditors, are there things they can take away from the last year in terms of how they might improve on their mission going forward?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that Doge did is they leveraged technology a lot more, and they also used artificial intelligence. And I think that one of the things that we need to be doing in the audit area is to have more continuous auditing, right? Not wait till sometime later and then look back what the heck happened, right? I mean,
Right.
so I think that's important. And I'll also tell you, Richard, that I think over time that once the Department of Defense is able to withstand an audit, and once we're able to express an opinion on the consolidated financial statements of the U.S. government, my personal opinion is that's all the public cares about. They don't care about audit opinions of all these different departments and agencies. They care about an audit opinion on the consolidated financial statements U.S. government. That's all the markets care about, right? And so I think that we still ought to do an audit of the consolidated financial statements U.S. government. You're going to have to do audit work throughout government, but you're not going to have express as many opinions. It's going to end up saving a lot of money. It's going to end up freeing up a lot of time. And I really think that the accountability community needs to be focused more on performance audits, compliance, and other and agreed upon procedures reviews much more than they are right now. I think there'd be a much greater return on investment. And by the way, GAO kind of is leading here because only about 15% of what GAO does has to do with the financial audit of the IRS, the Bureau of Public Debt, and the consolidated financial statements. The rest of it's really performance audits, policy analysis, legal reviews, best practices, lessons learned. That's where you generate the value for money. And when I left, it was over $100 return for every dollar invested in the agency. Number one in the world by far. Nobody was even close.
Yeah, and yet I think there are forces in Washington who would like to see the GAO budget roll back.
Well, the OMB and the GAO are, kind of at war right now, and it's really sad because I had very good relations with OMB, during my tenure. The head of OMB, and I'm not going to mention any names because I don't believe in being personal, has a distaste for GAO. The head of OMB got the House to be able to propose a 48% cut in GAO's fiscal 2026 budget. The Senate, I and others tried to help and held GAO steady. Candidly, we don't know what the final number is going to be, but I think it's looking more and more like, Richard, that we may even have a full year continuing resolution, which would mean the funding would be the same as last year, which is where the Senate was. And, they can deal with that. Okay. I mean, they can deal with it. But, GAO, unlike a lot of agencies, a vast majority of its budget's people cost. It doesn't have grants. It doesn't have a lot of contracts. I mean, and so, so to the extent that its budget is impacted, it has a direct impact on headcount.
Yeah. Dave, you were one of the, in fact, I will say you were the first person in our field that I ever heard talk about the role of auditors in providing foresight. And I remember being intrigued by that because I'd never heard of that. I'd never heard that concept put forward. So so where would you or what would you advise auditors, whether they're government auditors or whether they're auditors in the private sector, what would you advise them in terms of providing foresight when it comes to fiscal policy and debt in this country?
Well, let me tell you how I got to that. When I first came into GAO in 1998, the government was in surplus. And in fact, in 2000 and 2001, we actually paid down debt. And the Congressional Budget Office was projecting that we were going to have budget surpluses as far as the eye could see. And Chairman Greenspan from the Fed was worried because that was going to constrain the Federal Reserve on monetary policy. I, on the other hand, when I testified about the same time the chairman of the Fed did, I said, I'm not worried about that for a nanosecond because I know how this place works. Okay. And as a result, what ended up happening, we went from paying down debt, surpluses, to huge deficits, mounting debt burdens, and have lost control of the budget. Now, when I came to GAO, there's only two agencies in government that are government-wide, okay? The GAO in the legislative branch and the OMB in the executive branch. And the OMB is the one that ought to be leading the effort to try to come up with this comprehensive and integrated strategic plan for the executive branch, right? In partnership with the Congress and also learning lessons from GAO. So I said, look, I believe in practicing what I preach and leading by example. We need to develop a comprehensive and integrated strategic plan for GAO to serve the Congress and the American people. We did. It was future focused. It was outcome oriented. It recognized that our core values were accountability, what we did, integrity, how we did it, reliability, how we wanted to be received, and that we really did three kinds of work. We did oversight work, are people complying with the laws and regulations, et cetera? We did insight work, what works and what doesn't work, okay? And we did foresight work. Foresight work, what are the trends and challenges facing the United States, its position in the world? What can we do to try to help the Congress be ahead of the curve rather than always being in a reactive posture? And I think, that's important. I gave you an example with regard to the Postal Service. The big example is our fiscal condition. I was very, very outspoken, including in the media, about the fact that, that forget about today, known demographic trends, rising healthcare costs, and a variety of other features were going to make our financial situation over time much worse, and it was going to deteriorate if we didn't do something about it. And unfortunately, since I've left, it's gotten much, much, much worse.
Yeah, I think it seems like every time one of these crises come comes around, it seems to be an opportunity to spend what we don't have, whether it was the global financial crisis at the end of the 2000s or the COVID era. I think both of those were periods of extraordinary run up in the deficits and in the debt. Would you agree?
That's correct, and most of that was, the Federal Reserve bought a lot of that debt because they couldn't sell it on the market, right? And
Right.
now the Federal Reserve is in a situation where it's trying to get rid of that debt. Okay, it's trying to sell it on the open market, but when you're running $2 trillion deficits a year, it's kind of tough, right? In addition to that, what a lot of people don't understand, Richard, is we don't just have to fund 2 trillion a year. We have another 7 trillion of maturing debt. So that means that we have to go to the market to fund $9 trillion. And to the extent that we can get enough people who are willing to buy that debt at reasonable interest rates, it's one of the reasons that the fastest growing expense in the federal government is interest. And what do you get for interest? Nothing.
Right. Right. Well, Dave, listen, it's been fascinating as I knew it would be. It's great to catch up with you again. And thanks for all you do to try to raise awareness about these really critical topics. Thank you, Dave. And thank you to our audience for joining us in another episode of Speaking of Risk and Audit. For Audit Board, I'm Richard Chambers.